Apa kabar? My name is Ezra Ponadre. I'm a case counsel here at the Asian International Arbitration Center in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, more commonly known as the AIAC. Welcome to part 3 of the ADNDRC interview series entitled Voices Behind the ADNDRC Decision Drafting Guidelines. This short interview will provide an insight into the impact of the guidelines within the industry. We are pleased to be joined with Mr. Bahari Yeow, with over 20 years of experience in the fields of intellectual property law and general litigation. Bahari heads the intellectual property, technology, media, and telecommunications practice at Rosti Dahlan Saravana Partnership. Bahari is a qualified patent, trademark, and industrial design agent. He also sits as a domain name dispute resolution panelist at the Asian International Arbitration Center. He also served as a member of the Group Standing Committee for Copyright in the years 2015 to 2018, the Asian Patent Attorney Association, APAA, Malaysia. Mr. Bahari, good morning and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning as well. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Mr. Bahari, the Standards and Practice Committee of the ADNDRC published the ADNDRC Decision Drafting Guidelines in March of 2022. How do these guidelines assist the panelists in drafting decisions?
Now, let's start from the beginning. The object of Asian Domain Name Dispute Resolution Center, or ADNDRC, is to provide a comprehensive online dispute resolution services for domain name dispute. As the purpose is to provide a comprehensive online dispute resolution mechanism, it grows to meet changes, conditions with dynamism. So as the nature, the trade develop, person finds new way of committing theft of intellectual property, ADNDRC dispute resolution rose to the challenge. Now these guidelines are helpful in many folds. Now first, it focuses the panelists when drafting decisions with 3 broad objectives in mind. Number 1, access, certainty, and efficiency. Now the guidelines in large way ensure consistency and predictability, and at the same time ensure that justice and fairness is achieved at its optimum level.
Thank you. How did these guidelines change the way in which you've drafted your decisions, if at all?
It certainly does, Israel. I have no doubt that all of our panelists have a vast experience in this field, and many have even started practicing in this area even before the birth of ADNDRC. Now, however, these guidelines realign our thoughts in drafting our decision. As you will appreciate, online and virtual world e-commerce, cross-border transactions has become a norm in today's world. These inevitably give rise to different issues, and in some instances, cases have become far more complex than they were before. Now, Israel, the guidelines provide 2 broad ways of aid: procedural aspect as well as the substantive perspective. Now, the guidelines provide a proper structure and in some way formularize the dispute resolution mechanism. Now, they provide a proper roadmap in a systematic way, from the threshold issues, one aspect, identifying the parties, the backgrounds of the case leading to the disputes, both the parties' contentions, and at the same time, the conclusion, what's the findings and the decisions. Now, once the panelists take this roadmap into mind when deliberating the disputes, they will be able to write a very persuasive, high-quality decisions, or what we say a speaking judgment. Now, this is important to the effectiveness of processing or proceeding with resolving the dispute. Now, readers will be able to understand the decisions, and this will also lead to stability and predictability. The public and the business community will plan and organize their lives which is one of the foundations upon which our justice system operates.
Okay. Well, we've talked about some of the good points of the guidelines, but in your experience, have you seen any constraints that the guidelines have brought forward?
Yeah, certainly as well. Now, in my respectful view, the guidelines, while sought to guide the panelists from the procedural aspect and the substantive aspects, the guidelines, I mean, if you look at it, it divulged that the focus is more on the procedural as well as the format of the decision. Now, I believe the guidelines may be of further utility, especially to the newer panelists, if the guidelines can include two other aspects. A, guidelines on evidential evaluations, and B, lay down certain established principles which may guide the panelists in addressing substantive issues. I think that would make the guidelines even far more better. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the predominant purpose of the guidelines is to assist the panelists to stay focused, to remain focused in drafting the decision. Now, one of the issues which may be faced by the panelists is when they are faced with large or lengthy pleadings, substantial amount of evidence. The guidelines at this stage may not have offered any guide to the panelists, especially the newer ones, as to how they deal with all this evidence in a coherent manner. Now, while Part 4E2 provides a very useful reminder to the panelists as to the area in which they need to focus on when they address the substantive aspect of the dispute, it may be too basic in my humble view. Now, finally, the guidelines is certainly a very useful tool in addressing vast majority of cases. However, it may not always be the case when the new form or new norm of theft of intellectual property issues came about. The deliberation process may need to take into account new trend of issues. The panelists be the of course, the very nature of this kind of disputes, it always evolve over time. Now, for example, I can think of AI is certainly one of the issues which everybody talks about. Now, of course, as the days goes by, I'm sure ADNDRC will continue to review and improvise the guidelines to also take into account of this. But at this stage, I think that two aspects, as what I've mentioned, I think needs to be, if we could, to add those into the existing guidelines. It would be very helpful to the panelists.
Right. Well, I'd like to continue on from that, if I may. Now, you touched a little bit on what the guidelines could do better. Do you have any more thoughts on how they could be streamlined?
Now, in aspect of the evidential guide as well, it is not that, I'm not saying it in the aspect of as if it is some panel statute, but if the guidelines could provide a roadmap in aiding the panelists from the pleading up to the stage, the step-by-step process as to how they deal with the body of evidence which is presented before them, it would be very useful to assist the panelists in writing decisions in an orderly and coherent manner. Second, it may be also helpful if the guidelines can collate some of the established principles with some illustration. Now, this will be a useful tool for the panelists to consider the issues, the substantive issues, to reach a consistent and yet a fair decision.
Right. Well, thank you so much for commenting on the guidelines as a whole. And now, I'd just like to draw upon your body of experience. What are your personal best practices when handling proceedings and the drafting of decisions?
I suppose there's no rocket science about it, but I suppose some of these things that we need to bear in mind. Now, first, at the forefront of all the panelists' mindset, it must be one. The the need or the wish to impart justice in a fair and expeditious manner. Integrity must always be an important foundation in all decision-making process. Second, one must have a standard framework in mind in attending to the first objective mentioned above. Now, ADNDRC guidelines provide a very good framework in achieving this objective. Third, one must understand fully the contentions of both parties. Now, while ADNDRC provides online dispute resolution, the principles of audi alteram partem cannot be compromised. Don't just regurgitate the contentions by both parties. Understand them. It is only when one understands the contentions of both parties, the panelists will be able to address the issues fairly and in a coherent way. Now, fourth, evaluate the pleadings and the evidence very carefully and diligently and test it against the contentions of both parties. Now, thereafter, apply the facts to the law. Now, finally, like the locals say, don't leave seperti kata di bawah tempurung. Keep ourselves appraised as to what is happening out there, know what is the new developments. It is only when we keep ourselves updated, we will be able to deliver justice and address the issues and solve the problems that are encountered by the traders.
Thank you. So following from that question on your best practices, do you have anything to say regarding how best newer panelists can quickly adapt to UDR proceedings?
There's really no shortcut to this. Now, I suspect the ADNDRC guidelines will certainly set the tone and momentum and guide the new panelists towards the right directions. I would say, very briefly, three or four. Read, understand, open your eyes, open your ears.
Okay. Now, what are the more common mistakes you see newer panelists make, or perhaps you made when you were new?
Now, I may not be bold enough to classify this as a mistake. Now, perhaps I'll address this very generally and broadly. Now, without a proper structure in the decisions, reader may not be able to comprehend the directions or considerations taken into account by the panelists. Sometimes the decisions may comprise of regurgitating of the contentions of both parties, and when the panelists proceed to write its decisions, the ultimate decisions, there may be no linkage between the two. So it is sometimes said that it is a non-speaking judgment. Now, or sometimes people may even say that this is actually a template decision. Now, panelists must always understand, justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done.
Well, talking about template decisions, the Standards and Practice Committee also released template decisions for guidance, along with the guidelines. Do you deviate far from it?
Now, first, I do not take the template provided as the be-all and end-all templates. The primary purpose of the process is to impart justice, right? And to resolve the online disputes justly and expeditiously.
Right.
The ADNDRC guidelines and the template is useful as a tool to guide me in my thinking process to ensure that the grounds are laid out in an orderly and coherent manner. Okay, so that's what the guidelines is useful for. Now, the structure and format are very useful in most of the cases. Now, I will deviate only in some obscure cases where the grounds may be neater if it is presented in some other ways. Now, even in those kind of cases, my starting point is always premise on the structures of the template, because that actually guides me through my thinking process and to ensure that whatever I deliver, it is fair, it takes into account of all perspectives in that respect.
Right. Now, here at the Asian International Arbitration Center, we're situated in Malaysia. And on that, I'd like to ask our final question for the day, which is, in your experience, in your view, what do you think Malaysian panelists bring to the table in dealing with these cases?
Now, a lot of our panelists have very vast experience. This is also the same. It's also true as far as our colleagues in other jurisdictions. But one thing that make us stand out from the rest is that Malaysia is actually a multiracial, multilingual, and multicultural society. So with all this background, it actually assists us to understand different cultures, different languages, and different issues that happens, and this in some way help us in deliberating cases, because we are able to understand more cross-border transactions, issues faced by different jurisdictions because of our background. And also, I think many of our panelists are, I would say, are good in several languages. So, as you know, some of these disputes involve evidence of different languages. So in that way, I believe that sets us apart from the rest.
I believe it is safe to say that the introduction of the guidelines is very much needed for the industry. No doubt continue to ensure the high quality of decisions in disputes. Thank you, Mr. Bahari, for your time. Your experience and insight on the guidelines from a Malaysian perspective has been very helpful for our audience. And to our viewers, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.
Thank you.